Howdy, all you delicious people. This one is actually done in the day it's supposed to be. Because here's the thing: a lot of times I will be usually doing pre-done taping stuff. There was one video where I did real steel where I luckily was able to do that like a day before, and so reasonably going into this now, I was like, you know what? How about because ultimately there's a whole reason why I shaved my head. Yeah. Just kind of, I just felt really just bogged down. Just really just under the weather. Like I had no idea what it was, but I was like, man, this is like the worst that I've like ever felt as like being sick. But luckily, I could kind of rear and tape back that to just kind of do one interview today, and then ultimately just go out of my way to just do probably one gameplay today, and then I'll probably just call it a wrap. Because really, like, I still want to make sure that I'm definitely at 100% coming back to this because I don't want to like backpedal or anything like that. So I apologize for otherwise taking the time to talk about shaving head and all, shaved head and all, because recently it's a lot of times where shaving your head can really just kind of loosen up the cobwebs and make you feel a little bit better at some points in time. So luckily for me, things are happening. Things are happening, make me feel a little bit better. So weather the storms. Um, it wasn't anything serious. It was just kind of like the normal like bug that you would get legitimately. So luckily I'm bouncing back from that. So Power Rangers Megaforce. So Power Rangers Megaforce, we ideally there's some goofy things going on within these first 15 episodes. There's some goofy things going on. Ultimately, when looking back on this on IMDb, I ultimately realized that they had another juice bar like person named Ernie. Why? But justifiably, a lot of this stuff was seemingly trying to recycle off of Mighty Morphin, to be brutally honest. But there was some weird, goofy things going on. Um, I think in a previous interview or previous review, why am I saying interview? Like as if I interviewed myself. In a previous review, I talked about like, yeah, I know that there was some season where like the villains I think were mutants, and like I was trying to come up with what season that was. And recently, I couldn't come up with any of the names of any of these villains, but ultimately, I do know the minions were bizarrely loogies, which is the weirdest thing to have your minions be. That is like the weirdest, creepiest name. Loogies. Why would they all be loogies? That sounds like the worst. It sounds like the worst minion name. You could have called them uh, yellow greenies, and I think I would have been more accepting with that. You have Loogies as the minions, and you have one character, Gia, whose last name, which I talked about this in a previous video, and I don't want to rehash and bring it up, but respectively, Sierra Hannah. This woman, her last name is Moran, or what I would say will ultimately sound like Moran. And I'm like, what garbage is that? This is garbage. And it's not this actress' fault. Ultimately, again, probably all these people have grown up to love Power Rangers over time, or even in Sierra Hannah's uh, course, like she wanted to probably do a group thing because more than likely she grew up probably watching 90s X-Men and probably just like, yeah, a group project? I'm interested. Ultimately, a lot of these people probably grew up like ultimately like Jaden from Power Ranger Samurai, who numerous times over had worn red Power Ranger like costumes for numerous years until ultimately his parents were just like, "Eh, like seriously, you're gonna wear that one again?" Like me when I was young, I think I kind of wore numerous costumes over and over again, but in the end, I don't even remember about things because ultimately it's just it is what it is. Because how much can you remember? And plus, my mind right now is kind of a blur. But anyways, so we go into this in the first 15 episodes, as I consistently miss say it every single time. I ultimately would call Robo Knight Robo Ranger just because it's double R's, it's rest and relax, it's just me just ultimately like thinking of like, God, what is this guy's name again? Like he's really cool, but I can never remember his name because I'm a horrible person. Because that's what happens when you're trying to do these reviews or talk about something that you probably don't remember the name of. That's a horrible thing. But there's every time when I can go back and recorrect something, if something seems too god awful for me to go back in and like maybe that entire Power Rangers review, like ultimately just will be much more better off if I didn't do that one and then just do all of these ones. But it ends up that like that did really well for mistaking reasons because I made a lot of mistakes during that, and I will backtrack and try to correct them now. So, going into this, we have we have Andrew Gray who plays Troy as the Red Ranger, ultimately having this special ability, this like cognitive thing of seeing visions. I don't quite understand why exactly that ever like maybe they cleared that up at some point. I don't know. Maybe he was like Anakin and he was like not into a vicious villain like way, but eventually he's probably gonna just be like, yeah, I'm feeling some some future vibes. Otherwise, we have like we have at a lot of points. I don't understand why we still have in Power Rangers language these silly words where we have to have like these zoinks like moments and these yowie wowie like oh my god I'm scared kind of like verbiages going into stories. It never quite makes sense to me. Like I think at some point Azim ultimately plays Jake. He ultimately had this like one line when they go into the command center or their version of their command center, and like he had some like goofy esh like line, like a kind of like yowie wowie moment, and I'm like that that the whole like why like why do we have weird catchphrases being like put into the command centers? It makes no sense. I don't know. It is what it is. Think about this though. Going into their command center, why was their command center so ridiculously bare? Like you have every single like action figure of every single Power Ranger around them, and then you have the morpher that is also the headpiece in the middle of this. But if you kind of look around, the rest of this command center part is so ridiculously bare. And I don't remember who the Zordon character's name is in this thing, but like, I'm just like, okay, here's the goofy thing that I realized after watching this. I'm like, wait a minute. So all the gold emblems that are placed onto every single person's chest ultimately is just a big symbol. I guess I can get around with that. Like, if ultimately you can just really go into these seasons and just be like, dude, they can only do so much. Like, there's only so many wheels in the cog of trying to figure out how to do any of these. that I guess you just need emblems to just kind of like have one big emblem that ultimately is placed on the last ranger, because like Robo Knight is wearing the entire sigil on top of his like forehead. And like in my head I'm thinking like, you know what, like I guess I could buy into the whole symbol of things, like you have individual symbols that are slapped on people's chest. I don't, I like the whole side helmet thing where you reasonably have a, you have to like look at somebody's side to otherwise understand what ranger they are, even though that probably might look stupid to a lot of people. I don't know. I'm not pressing or guessing anybody. Recently when looking at this show, I don't know. I think some of the like I like the smart Noah Esch like character. I think because ultimately it's another one of those like Billy moments where it's like, he had to say so much like smart Esch like crap that I'm sure he probably didn't want to. He probably didn't really want to say, but ultimately kind of forced into. Here's the one thing that I liked about these 15 seasons. There's one episode where we have a guy that otherwise walks into the quote unquote whatever this is, whatever juice bar this is for this season, because it seems like everything was recycled from Mighty Morphin. No offense, just that's how it feels. The one thing that we have in these first 15 episodes was a guy that was supposedly taking credit as a Power Ranger, and then ultimately he has to forcibly go out there and he's like, oh crap, now I have to actually say I was a Power Ranger, but now I actually have to perform as one. And the other Rangers are like watching him and looking at him and they're like, yeah. Like, is he going to do something foolish? I want to see him go out there and just get blasted and just like sparked up or whatever the heck happens to humans in this show. Because normally when putties or in this season loogies get hit, they usually get sparks all over their bodies. It would be interesting to see what happens to a normal human. Do they get sparks? I'm curious. So but eventually the rangers end up like having to like save his bacon, and then the guy otherwise like confesses that he's like, yeah, I wasn't a Power Ranger, I wasn't at all, because he was talking such a big game. He was talking about like, yeah, like at first I was gonna get off for this other Power Ranger color, but you know what, I traded up. Sure, okay, all right, just yeah, you be you. You be you. So ultimately, we have within these episodes, we kind of have a barrage of like bizarrish like episodes, which like there is some good out of them, but then there's also those times where it seems like the villains were made up before, like the villain monsters were made up before, like the costumes were made up before they actually figured out what to do with them. Like there was one episode where there was this like mariachi or kind of like sombrero esh like villain that ultimately like would create these the Dreamcatcher like episode where ultimately you have it to where this monster bizarrely could make people fall down to the ground and grow roots. I'm like, wait a minute. So you have a character that like looks nothing like that. You would think that this monster would have been like a tree monster and he would have created roots and that would have been like it would have been Groot before Groot. It would have basically been a Groot before Groot. You basically have like he wouldn't be saying I am whoever the villain is that day, but ultimately he would be like a person that would actually fit the role of And I get it. Like, you only hash out so many number of certain kind of villains, and then you write the story maybe afterwards. Like, basically, with Sabin just probably at this point, like, through many a seasons, you have a huge amount of just, like, there's a helmet guy, there's a suit guy, there's probably a monster guy. So ultimately you just have like, okay, we've already created like 12 monsters for every single 12 episodes. So we'll just write in like which monster whichever episode, even if it doesn't make sense for the costume to fit the story. It's just like, well, we already have like X amount of monsters going out, so like we're just going to try to use all of them even if the story does make sense. But maybe it did. Maybe there was some justification, which I boggled my mind out of missing. But ultimately, I was like, this guy is like a bull rider, like villain, and I'm just quite scratching my mind to figure out like the whole dream catching scenario connection. But not only that, also the root thing that is created. I'm like, what? Like, was this monster supposed to be like a dream catcher monster and they couldn't figure out an equivalent for that? I don't know. I'm going into this episode way too much. Because ultimately, like, Emma, the Christina, God bless her. Man, did she have to be in this episode just like, yeah, just dreams can come true. And I bet she probably is like that, which is completely okay. Because at the end of the day, every single one of these Power Rangers, given in a different light, could every single one of them, probably be a really good, like, Red Ranger. And I'm talking, like, the men, of course, even the one who was Troy Red Ranger. Like, you could just play it again, buddy. Just try it. Just don't be Anakin. I'm seeking things from the future because, like, if anything, funny enough, Andrew's last name is Gray, which I'm like you couldn't have pitched like, hey, Gray. It's a joke. It's just a joke. It's meant to be that. Not that I'm saying that Troy like ultimately didn't deserve to be a Red Ranger. I'm just saying every one of these could have been a Red Ranger. I think this is a decent cast put in a very goofy like roles of sorts. So they tried their best ultimately going into this. Yeah, we had seemingly Jake and Gia like seemed to right away like it seems like there was a consistent like will they won't they kind of thing going on. Like Jake was really just like, man, if only I could just like take pictures of women and because ultimately, yeah, you're in a role where like you're seeing like good looking women all day long. Like I know ultimately the guy that plays or plays the guy that does the YouTube channel called the Black Nerd Comedian. Ultimately, and that's where I got a little tiny bit of my information from. I'm not siphoning off. I'm not. But it probably sounds like it, but it is what it is. So yeah, so we have to where these people doing these interviews, and where am I going with this? Let's rewind a little bit back. So because I don't remember where I was going with it, the tangent just off. So yeah, so going into this, every one of these people could have been a really great Red Ranger. And I think that's all I want to say about that. Because I think I've said that enough at some point in time. But really, it could have been. It could have been. It's not their fault. It's not their fault that the season went the way they did. And again, looking at that stupid, goofy command center where you had like these black boxes that had like these colors in them, I didn't understand it at all. But yeah, so Jake, Gia, or yeah, Jake and Gia. Isn't that a little goofy? Thinking of it now, Jake and Gia. Why did they have them like seem to have like this will they won't they moment? No offense to it, like ultimately Azim was was basically just like, hey, like whatever I can get, whatever I can get, and it seems like they were just kind of like a real kind of like tug of war and stuff like that. They were having these like fun little moments. It was all great, and this and that. But anyways, so like it was interesting to have Mr. Burley to where like Jake is just kind of like fumbling with his with his tool supplies when they were going through the the field trip, like, and then we have Mr. Berkeley who freaking takes a rake to the face. Like, it's like, make sure that you guys all like mind your surroundings, and then we have Mr. Berkeley who ends up taking a rake to the face. Like classic moves, like as if we're tailoring back to a time once much more, let's just say, Mighty Morphin, because I keep coming back to that. So anyways, yeah, so it doesn't seem throughout these 15 episodes that we had like, it seemed we had like a Bulk and Skull like thing going on. Here's my thing. Here's my pitch to this season. I think that really we could have actually, I don't think there was enough going on with the Rangers. Like they're like a lot of the times these Rangers came off as like models, and they all feel, it all felt like every single one of them were in some like model commercial, and that's what everything felt like to me. Everything felt like every single one of these characters were like casted from a catalog, because every one of them were all like, it seemed like all of them were models before they all came to this, and I'm not sure if that is what it is. Probably not. I doubt it. Just be not, no offense to any of them. It's just like all of them look like they were like picked out of a catalog, because ultimately that's the direction that most of the time they went with all these Power Ranger moments, is like everything was like they at some point were gonna like grab a product and say Dior and then pull it away and just like that's what everything breaks down to when you have the Power Rangers moments. I honestly think that, God, the one themed concept that I wish a Power Ranger season could either go back to or be put in. I honestly wish that Power Rangers would have these like would have a very much like, I know this is pitched to kids, but when looking at it, you could have it be like a horror kind of movie, or a horror kind of like those old fashioned ones when they were actually good. There are some current good horror movies, but like every once in a while you can dip into the bottle of an 80s kind of, I don't know exactly 80s, but somewhere ballparking around that. When what I would think about this season is you probably could have had like a news reporter that was consistently like begging to try to get like some exclusives in this season. More than likely there was probably another Power Ranger show that probably did that. But like, and I know there's probably some like interviewer girls that desperately probably wanted to get some exclusives and stuff like that. But man, if only you could have had it to where, here's where you could have had this Bulk and Skull like moment where you had this interviewer that like consistently gets into the face of every like mutated, maybe that's why Sierra definitely wanted to be a part of the season, because mutant mutant villains, maybe somebody was siphoning off of like some the word mutants, and then they're like, yeah, let's have like, seems like Sierra likes X-Men from the 90s, so I'm going to make all the villains mutants. Hilariously enough. Like you had that one skyscraper moment where you had that like one goopy villain. Like there was a whole episode about like goop, where you had this like goopy ash like villain that was like cemented onto this skyscraper, and he like drops down, and it's just like an episode about goop. Okay, yeah, because every kid who's ever seen a Nickelodeon show would like slime, and so ultimately you have goop, or purplish goop in this episode. It seemed like this goop had some like weirdish properties, like some or like acid something, or I don't remember once seeing this like minutes ago because brain is so going into this. Yeah, we tapering back to the moment. Yeah, like ultimately mutant moment. Anyways, so a lot of this is going to be all tangenting around to eventually get to some cementing like moment. Because ultimately I'm just Babylon 5ing it right now. So we have it to where in this season, and God, I went through so many tangents that I was like, what was my original thought? That's what happens. That's what happens when you do a review. But anyways, yeah, every single one of these like characters were all similarly models. Again, no offense to the actors about this, but more than likely they probably will feel they probably feel that. Um, like yeah, here's where I was going. News reporter. Good God. Yeah, horror 80s, like you could have a news reporter that is desperate to get some exclusives. Recently you could have them be to where like I think the monsters never really ambushed anybody. They never really ambushed anybody. They never really like nothing was ever really and truly an ambush or attack. Like a lot of times, like the monster would just show up, Power Ranger would just show up, and then ultimately, like a lot of times, eventually, like the monster would just suck somebody into their stomach or something like that. But like a lot of times, you wouldn't ambush always. Like every once in a while, you would see a putty that ultimately changes from a person to a putty. I guess that would quasi be a trap, but like especially the later seasons, it just kind of like the villain shows up, the Power Ranger shows up, even if they are all are from catalogs. Abercrombie in power. Deal. Anyways, it's not my fault that every single one of these characters are actually like gonna be in a model ad after this, or gonna be models after this. It is what it is. But anyways, like probably when looking at these, probably every single one of these, like, because I know, supposedly in the Power Rangers Samurai season, I think every single one of them were Americans, and then they all were sent to New Zealand. So ultimately, I'm kind of curious in this, were they all Americans, and then they were all sent to New Zealand? Because every single season, evidently, it was all just, yeah, let's just send these people to New Zealand. Man, could you just imagine if you were like just thinking that's like, yeah, I would love to do Power Rangers and New Zealand, place of Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and all that business. Thumbs up. No problem with New Zealand. I love New Zealand. Um, but I don't know. Maybe they were like, maybe they're like, whoa, like flying out and who knows, 12-hour flight, maybe more than that. Anyways, going into these episodes, yeah. So Loogies, what the f were them? In the end, Robo Knight had a kind of comedic performance with Noah. Evidently, Robo Knight and Noah were the only two people in one episode that could get jokes or couldn't get jokes. So ultimately, they had to figure out how to make people laugh. I think that like boils down to like what like I guess that was like a Killjoy episode. We ultimately had to have like uh he ultimately had to have like that kind of moment in that. Sure. you ultimately had like there were so many episodes that I thought were just kind of like, well, hey, they're trying. They're trying. Um, yeah, recently we had it where like Jake brought in this huge like axe like sword and he was wielding it like it weighed like 1,000,000 pounds, just like flinging it around like nobody's business. And I'm like, dude, you could take somebody's eye out with that. You could Christmas Story take somebody's eye out with that. And like, and I'm just like, what is going on with this? What is like willy nilly? Like the guy is swinging some sword that he definitely cannot. Like it's too heavy to wield. Supposedly, it probably weighed like a pound, but he probably had to like act like it weighed like 30. Because a lot of the times you'll find out like afterwards, like the proton packs of on Ghostbusters weighed like 30 to 50 pounds or something like that, and like all kinds of interesting information that you would randomly find out about like Ghostbusters, how a lot of the stuff was ad-libbed, a lot of the lines, especially the one where it was uh the one about if someone asks you you're a god, you say yes. That was ad-libbed. But anyways, so ultimately, shout out to Ernie Hudson, big great guy of yeah, seen Ghostbusters numerous times. Anyways, because ultimately I would probably shoot like a Power Rangers season like I probably would Ghostbusters, where like at first they think they're just like, okay, let's just punch this out and try to and hope that we can beat this, but then they end up realizing that they like get like ambushed or they get trapped, and so they ultimately realize, hey, how about we run away? And then eventually, but they realize that they have to grow much more confidence and realize it's like, well, no one if we run away, no one else is going to combat this, and so they go back in and a second time to eventually like they not to say that Power Rangers are going to be like are they going to be scaredy cats? No, it's going to be like a New Mutants like moment to where every single thing that is presented in front of them is something that is ultimately going to scare them, especially when they start out. Like, wouldn't that make sense if this is your very first Power Rangers like experience and you're thrusted with a monster in front of you? Wouldn't you actually be scared at first? Wouldn't you just be like, whoa, sir? I am a little scared of you because ultimately I've never seen one of these things before. Like, wouldn't it take some adjustments? Like, not just like, oh yeah, monster, I've seen you a million times before. Oh, nice boots there, buddy. Nice boots. That's the biggest complaint that I have about every single Power Ranger season. When you have Mighty Morphin, you would have times where they would create monsters to like kind of begrudge a fear of some of the Power Rangers like Billy with Fish and all these kinds of other things. But here's my thing. One, they rarely ever did do that. A lot of times they would have to like mix in some monster that wouldn't tie into the Rangers, or it would just be like this random justifying like you would have to tie a character's journey with a monster that could like also like combat that, like, oh, Christina's gonna have a dream, Emma's gonna have a dream, well, we're gonna have a dream crusher. It's like dude, you couldn't have come up with a like anyways, I think that like yeah, it's just like if you have Power Rangers that have to adjust to doing this, like I get the whole like fighting something and then running away from it sounds goofy, but like justifiably so if this is your especially your first go around. Like, I don't get the huge amount of confidence that everyone would have. And that's the biggest thing I never understood. Um, but I guess good on every one of these people that they could just punch and kick away and just ultimately like, because ultimately the bizarre thing that comes up later is that a lot of times the monsters focus on their fears. A lot of times they end up like being written into specifically like a dream catcher-ish like monster. They focus on a fear of theirs or whatever, and I never understood why wouldn't pilot episode, pilot approach, you would have people be like, "What the f is that? I'm scared," because you gotta work up to that to where they are no longer a person that is scared, and then eventually ultimately just goes into just like, okay, like I've seen this enough. I have to build up the confidence every single time to fight these things. It's not so easy. And so I think a Power Ranger season done that way, man, would people be finally like, you get some point columns into fan service, because like for me personally, but I probably for everyone else is like, yeah, kick and punch and yeah, never get scared. Because ultimately, like the Halloween special of the real Ghostbusters will ultimately tell you like, if you're not afraid, it can't hurt you. But but going into it, like it's the bizarre thing to backpedal and then have fear episodes. Fear episodes. Like specifically, you have like, I don't remember how many episodes you'd have like somebody who'd like severely cower in fear, and then eventually backpedaling to every single other ranger is all either uh like gobbled up or just incapacitated. So you would have this one person that is so utterly scared, forcibly needing to face their one fear because every single ranger is just incapacitated at some point. So, not only talking about this season, but also kind of backpedaling about a bunch of other stuff. But I think, like, reasonably, I think some of this otherwise ties to this season. Like, I think Troy. Here's where I'm backpedaling and I'm reconnecting this back in. So we had Troy, who would have these nightmares. And here's where I'm tying this back in. Troy would have these nightmares about this big battle he doesn't understand. Like, I think that's good to do that right away. Like, I think that's the best point. But again, like, basic. So he knew he was going to be a Power Ranger right away through this dream, like sequence. Did like, but again, like they never fully fledgedly did anything with like for like I don't. You could ultimately say it's like no, they did something, but because ultimately they probably did. It just, you would have think that the thought process would have been like, okay, this dream comes up on the pilot, and now we're gonna like, I, yeah, it just ends up being what it is. We have an Ernie rebooted juice bar that ultimately every once in a while, people would pop in and like do bizarre shit. The model. Like, because basically we had the whole scene where Jake is like taking photos and the two girls are supposedly fighting over a popsicle, and funny enough it's a yellow popsicle. But anyways, so they were doing like model shots and Jake was like, yeah, like look sad, look. Or he wouldn't say that, but it was like yeah, give, like do more, like yeah, get to this, and then ultimately you have like Troy in the background who's like pointing at them like ha ha ha, like, and then bizarrely did they like reuse that footage like in some other camera angle, because it looks like Troy like does the ha ha thing twice. Ultimately, I could be looking at that wrong, but like, I don't know. It looks like from another camera angle they use like two different cameras in two different situations. popping those same moments, and so you have Troy doing twice. Uh, but ultimately, someone could probably correct me about that. But anyways, so mutants. What a what a like. I think mutants was an interesting like concept for a villain, but I don't think they really like. There was a lot of like. I remember in some episodes there were some like evolutions of stuff, or there'd be some kind of like ultimately like. Here's one episode that I did like, and ultimately I'm backpedaling again here. Here's one good thing. Like there's some villain concepts that I liked, like some overall just like interesting execution. There was one discus like villain that they had in I think one of these episodes. I could be wrong because I'm strongly thinking that I should be getting this correct, but I don't remember the name of this villain. We had this one like discus like villain that threw this like giant bizarrish looking silver like discus like thing that had these weird looking like spikes at the end of it. And what happened was is that this villain, like when the villain first did not succeed, they made like a volume 2 of this same villain to make it so that he's better. Like I thought that was a great concept for this episode, but I wish that they could do that a lot more. When looking at it, yeah, there was so many times where you could have had this idea churned out a lot more, where you could have like a volume 2 of a villain when ultimately they were too weak to ultimately be pushed out. Because a lot of times when you get a lot of these creators, they would mess stuff up. like, just like, it's all a drawing board, really. Here's another thing that they never did, and I don't think any single Power Rangers episode, but probably someone could correct me on this. Here's one creator of a Power Ranger season that I think would honestly be really cool. You could have the main villain sitting down, eating some popcorn, whatever, some goofy like scenario, having Zed on his throne, I don't know. And bizarrely, for some reason, we could have a villainish television that is propped in front of some said villain, and maybe he you have the main villain who ultimately picks from this TV, like pulls from this TV, whatever random demonic television this is, he plucks things from this TV to ultimately be plopped into a scenario. So, like, say for example, like here's an idea that I have. You have a villain that is a demonic game show host, and so ultimately he is. So this is like the Finster kind of moment. So we have it to where there's some demonic game show host that basically tortures all the contestants. Like I think like when you get to extreme like Japanese game shows, I think you can really justify this. So ultimately, you could have like a main villain watching like his devilish game show, and he pulls from the TV this game show host to be plopped into the real world, and you could do a whole episode about that. Like if you're going to have this being shown on TV, what if you go the extreme meta approach and basically like have a alternate world TV that shows everything in a very much dark light and pull from that and then invent, instead of having a finster, have this just simple concept of a villain who plucks from a TV from an alternate dimensional weirdish like world. And that's how you create your villains. um I don't know. These are probably silly concepts. I don't know. When I'm going through them, I'm just thinking of stuff. Um, but yeah, like ultimately talking about Power Rangers in general, because like probably some of these episodes aren't maybe sadly like some of the concepts are just kind of it's copy and paste from Mighty Morphin. Sadly enough, because that's what it feels like. But yeah, like like I know like this is kind of like a there's a main focus on like legendary battle when it comes to the very end of this season, because I think I've pretty much seen the whole thing, remembering it as like even it felt like the legendary battle kind of felt like a very clickbaiting like event. Um, I should probably go into like Super Megaforce to actually see what happens after that. If I even life is a blur. You kind of seen too many Power Rangers episodes at this point. Like there's too many tapering things. So maybe I'm gonna have to go back and correct a lot of stuff. So at the end of the day, here's some more interesting Power Rangers concepts. While barely talking about some of the episodes, I apologize if people were like having a real wanting of in depth, like yeah, talk about every single one of these 15 episodes, and I probably brought up like five of them. But yeah, so we have it to where I'm going to have to pause here for a second. Okay, I had to take a second. I had to take a quick little second to just make sure, like, I'm just going to take a breath here and just kind of think about all the stuff. So, just kind of finishing up. Yeah, so we had like these little small alien drones that come flying in, and eventually the Power Rangers eventually like Gia and Jake both notice them, and I think Jake is kind of just fluffing it off, and Gia quickly gets her morpher so that way she could talk to the Rangers to let them know that this thing is going on. And like god, that like I like that. Like it seems that they're like I wish that there were these kind of like moments like again like Ghostbusters where you would have like these weird like little things going on where you would have these like unexplained things, and then the Power Rangers would just take it upon themselves to just go like a lot of times they would probably have to be like called upon to go to certain locations and like fight these things that no one else could fight. It's like, and I'm not talking about like, yeah, let's all have every single one of these all in the same location. No, like you would have these like I'm talking like supernatural esh like things where they would have to like go out of like go to numerous states, or they would have to go through like people would be like if you're gonna have a news anchor, like why not have all these stories about the news anchor like going to certain locations and like and having a monster that already exists, that now the Power Rangers going, yeah, I guess we should look into that, and then surefire enough like they would take care of it by either like if you're looking at the Mandalorian, how the Mandalorian had this like big, huge, like like worm-ish like thing coming out of this big cave. It's like heck, like why not have like the Power Rangers going like, yeah, I guess we should fight that. You know what? Like I think it was good on Gia, but like Jake was also just like, yeah, I think something's gonna happen with this eventually, and like Gia's like, well, yeah, like I'm gonna call to make sure that something doesn't happen. So, and again, like there was like I think that overall, like some people could say that some of these like I like the mutation thing, but maybe like not all the visuals of the monsters land. Like, looking back on them now, um And I think the Aurora box made one of the villains like much more powerful. Aurora box. We have a Aurora box, and I think it was that was the whole glue episode where the goo episode where he had the Aurora box, and that thing is exceedingly powerful, and it bumps up the power of the villains. It has like the like, and it's not ooze. I think it might have been glue. It might have been a glue. It might have been a glue. It might not have. It might. Yeah. Like weird, like kind of monsters made out of like weird, bizarrish, like ape characters. Probably now thinking of it, there was probably a monster called Bull Fur. I think that was ultimately one of the villains. Bull or Blue Fur. Man, the brain's really churning right now. Blue Fur? I want to say Blue Fur because I think the guy was actually literally had blue fur on his costume. Man, these names are creative. That's probably why I can easily forget a lot of this. Because the names are just not that good. The names are just like, look at Gia's last name, and you can look at basically how you can approach the names of every single character in this. And every single name was throwaways. That's why it's super hard to remember any of them, because every single thing was a throwaway as far as name goes. Nothing was a real true attempt to legitimately, like, everything was tying upon visuals in this season. That is the biggest thing. Is basically just like with Super Sentai, it's basically like when looking at it, it's like, well, hey, all we just need to do now is the visuals and just like relate this all around the world. And like, no one's gonna really care about the names anymore. No one's gonna care about it's just visuals at this point. Like, when looking at Power Rangers Samurai, I'm like, man, those visuals are amazing. But when looking at it, like, the Power Rangers are, besides Jaden's character, which mad respect to me mentioning a different Power Ranger in a different season and just complimenting him. Like, yeah, like that story, even though it was just kind of like the second season, just kind of it Super Samurai was. Funny enough, I think Noah was consistently uh, talking about the season as if it was mega. I'm sure it is. Everything about the season was mega because it forces you. It forces you to see some good in it. I want to see some good in this season. When you got the catalog Abercrombie and Fitch like moments. But I think that's all I want to say about these episodes because again, I'm really trying to backpedal and come up with all these things. Um, there was like a insect villain character that tried to push Yellow and or Emma and Gia like against one another, and I'm just like, one bug like bug villains are kind of like the easiest to go about doing for monsters. It's and like recently, like again, you just don't have a good enough story for it. You just didn't. Anyways, this season for this point is what it is. I eventually probably want to do more episodes, but like more than likely they probably might be in much more detail. I'm just backpedaling a lot because I'm just like, what was it? What was it? Like Robo Knight was probably very interesting when we had a character that just kind of seemed like very RoboCop-ish, and I think that that is really the way that they approached this was just like, man, like RoboCop is still a popular thing, and you know we haven't done in a while. A Robo like a Robo like hero. When looking at this, like visually, I think Robo Knight is interesting. It just like comes off as like a robotic ranger, and like ultimately you get it to where like I like the visual of it, but when looking back on these episodes, you have like Robo Knight when it comes down to the Dream Snatcher episode. I said Dream Catcher, I think I meant Dream Snatcher. You have it to where he is just kind of like going in and is like, well, I'm just going to destroy the roots of the of when Emma ultimately gets rooted. We ultimately have it to where Robo Knight is just like, I'm just gonna shoot this off. Like, or ultimately, Robo Knight would just go on his own and just think that he's like the best out of all the Rangers, and so then eventually he would have to eventually backpedal, or sometimes he would sacrifice himself to take a hit because ultimately all the other Rangers weren't morphed, and so he would jump into the limelight and get hit, and then ultimately by some villain, and then ultimately the Rangers were like, look at him, and it's like, hey man, and then ultimately he would have to bow out because he would get hit and they would get hurt, and then he would just leave for the rest of the episode. So, anyways, yeah, like there are some interesting things that they did with Robo Knight. I like the confidence in the character where like he thinks that he's great and that he can solve stuff, or that he can solve stuff better than people, or that ultimately like the whole like the laughing episode where it was like a Killjoy like episode where um Robo Knight was like, well, I'm the perfect person for this job, but then ultimately they would have to do a comedic act where Noah and Robo Knight would have to do uh this gig where ultimately Robo Knight would have to be Noah's straight man, and so ultimately they would eventually make the villain of that episode. They would make him laugh, and that's what eventually like caused every. That's what caused them to win through this whole thing, was to make the monster himself laugh. And like again, backpedaling through some of these episodes, but you know what? Like some of them, like they why is it every time that they always have to suck somebody into some kind of like jar or jug or like thing of something? They do that all the time in here. Like they have to where, like I think in the Mighty Morphin episode, the one where Trini had like a show and tell like moment where she had this like uh tickle sneezer monster, where ultimately like pop the cork of that thing, and ultimately like people would just get sucked in, like Billy and somebody in a car would get sucked into like the tickle sneezer thing, and I thought that was such a goofy thing. But you have it to where like somebody like laughs and they get sucked into some like dream I dream of Genie like moment, and yeah, that's what every single time I see like somebody getting sucked into something, like it pops into my head like an I dream of Genie moment, where you have it to where bizarrely like it's either somebody gets eaten and gets sucked into. What is up with every single Power Ranger thing? Somebody has to get sucked into something. It's either somebody's like it's got to be a a edible monster where the monster eats every Power Ranger, or it's got to be a jug monster where somebody's being sucked in, or you have also something about music, like a musical monster that comes up so frequently. goofy. Like when I was watching Beast Morphers, they had some like tuba esh like episode, which I thought was the goofiest thing that I've ever seen in my life. But like it is what it is, and writing is what it is, and I'm not trying to like shovel in all of that. Just be like, yeah, these writers, because ultimately that's a problem. It's a problem. You ultimately have it to where every single writer, it's just they either recycle or they just go like, you know what, like this show has been around a long time, right? And plus also, it's really hard to always do a show every week, even though everybody would just forcibly tell you that it's like, yeah, but I wanted my character to go somewhere. Or it's just like, well, yeah, it's like, why not just actually give us something interesting? It seems like they try to do that. It seems like looking at this, like you would get Gia that I think really out of probably all the other characters, like kind of stood out because it seems like a lot of times she was probably poking fun at people, but then again, like she would be a like I think like if anything she just stood out through all these people because a lot of the times everybody else was kind of bland, or you just have like Troy that ultimately has his like dream visions while he's sitting on a bus dreaming about his legendary event that he's gonna have someday. um and then you would have like all these characters eventually like one by one all plop in within these this pilot episode. Like I think that's kind of goofy. Like in the very pilot episode, you have everybody eventually slowly but surely trickle in as you have to like in the very first pilot, they have to get like their own moments of soloingly be built in, which I thought was kind of goofy. But anyways, that's just what it ends up being at the end of the day, and I think that's all I wanted to say. I took an hour to talk about all this, and plus I backpedaled with a lot of stuff, and I ultimately like, and yeah, and in one of these 15 episodes, I think there was a music villain within this episode, and ultimately you had it to where the Power Rangers had to like counteract that. I'm like, anyways, I think that's all I wanted to talk about. Power Rangers Megaforce. It's just like, man, you could have done something. You could have done something with the approach of these stories. Um, if anything, yeah, it's could be a greater. It could have been a better, less seemingly cheaper. Hey, everyone, be like you're in a catalog. I bet did everyone that worked on the season land. I hope every one of them all landed commercials after this. Man, they should have landed a crap ton of commercials after this because they were like all like perfect for commercials. It's bizarre to say, but that's how I felt. So hopefully they did that. But anyways, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.